The following video will demonstrate how to solder two wires together using a butt joint, how to solder through-hole components onto a printed circuit board or a PCB, and how to use solder wick in the case of a mistake. Warning: soldering irons and hot air guns are extremely hot. Please use extreme caution when working with these devices. First, arrange your workstation so that your materials and your tools are easily accessible. How to make a butt joint. Strip about 6 or 7 millimeters of insulation off of the ends of the two wires you wish to join. Clean the wires with alcohol. Use a third hand to hold the two wires steady while you solder them together. Slip a piece of heat shrink tubing over one of the wires. The heat shrink should be about 3 times the length of the exposed wire. In this case, that would be about 20 millimeters. Apply a small amount of flux to the two wires. Clean the tip of the soldering iron on the damp sponge. Apply a small amount of solder to the very tip of the soldering iron. Make firm but gentle contact between the soldering iron and the wires. You will see the flux evaporate very quickly. Touch the tip of the solder to the two wires until the two wires have a thin coating of solder along the exposed length of wire. This should take place within a few seconds. Let the solder joint cool for a few seconds. Slide the heat shrink tubing along the wire until it is centered over the solder joint. The flux is used as a rapid heat transfer agent, and the gas it produces also keeps the wires from oxidizing. Use a hot air gun to heat the tubing until it shrinks down evenly around the wire's insulation. Be careful you do not overheat the wire's insulation, as it may melt. Now let's look at how to populate a printed circuit board or PCB with through-hole components. It is best to start with the components that sit closest to the board. In this case, the resistors. Start by finding the first set of resistors you wish to attach to the PCB. Clean the leads of the resistors you will be installing. Clean the pads on the PCB where these resistors will be installed. Lay a resistor down on the board so that it is centered on the location where it will be installed. Use a pair of needle nose pliers to grab the lead of the resistor just inside where you will need to bend the lead. Never use the pliers to make the bend. This could cause a stress fracture inside the body of the component, which may result in a change of the component's electrical properties or even cause an open circuit. Repeat the bending process for the other side of the resistor. Feed the leads through the holes in the PCB. Repeat this process for the remaining resistors in the same vicinity. Using care to not let any of the components fall out, flip the board over and lay it down on your work surface. Use a piece of insulated 22 gauge wire as a guide to trim off the excess lead length from the components to be soldered. You should never trim the leads after they've been soldered, as this can cause a stress fracture within the solder joint. Place a small amount of flux on each of the pads and wires to be soldered. Clean the tip of the soldering iron on the damp sponge. Apply a small amount of solder to the very tip of the soldering iron. Make firm but gentle contact between the soldering iron, the pad, and the lead. Apply heat to the pad and lead for about 2 seconds. Apply the solder to the pad and lead until a small volcano shape has been achieved. Remove the solder and the soldering iron as soon as the shape has been achieved. Lingering too long can cause icicles to form, resulting in a cold solder joint, or it may cause damage to either the pad, the component, or both. Apply a small amount of solder to the very tip of the soldering iron. Clean the remaining flux off of the PCB using an acid brush with alcohol. In case you make a mistake, solder wick can be used to remove the solder from the lead and the pad. First, remove any previously used solder wick. Apply a small amount of flux to the joint to be reworked. Apply a small amount of flux to the solder wick. Clean the tip of the iron. Apply a small amount of solder to the tip of the iron. Apply light pressure to the solder wick on the pad and lead. Remove the wick and the iron as soon as you see the solder has been removed from the hole in the PCB. Make sure you remove them both at the same time, or the wick may tear the pad off the PCB. This concludes the demonstration.